So just some guidelines for today as we think about it. One is we will intentionally welcome the Lord to be with us in this day and entrust that everything we say will be consistent with Colossians 4 verse 6. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response to everyone. As I put this together, I don't want this experience to be one where we criticize, condemn, attack one another. Sometimes we have to get at things that some of us will feel maybe somewhat protective or defensive about. Someone might address, something we do in the life of the church and say, well, why would we still do that? And some of us might feel very protective of it. I know that. That's why we have to be I think we have to try to speak truth as we best understand it, but also speak it with great grace. And so that's kind of what that's about there. While this will be a day to talk about both the strengths and the weaknesses of our church, it is not a time for any of us to speak accusingly or ill of anyone or cause anyone to feel defensive. So I've kind of said that. I don't know why. I checked this out because I have had problems with it before, and it seemed to be working perfect. I'll move to this side. Not every thought offered. Now here's this. You got to know this kind of reflects the convoluted way my brain works. But it's how I believe we hear God in the community of faith. And that is, we listen to one another. None of us should have the presumption to say, because I have said something, it is of God. I would not do that. I would say, and at times have said, as I've thought about it, as I've prayed about it, I sense God saying this, but always in a spirit of, but what do you think? Is that of God or is that my own agenda? And so that's what this is getting at. Not necessarily everything that is said here is going to be of God. I mean, I hope you're okay with that. But one of the signs that it might be of God is if it resonates deeply with most of us and is clearly obedient to what, God through Scripture calls us to. If we go, yeah, that lines up with what God calls his people to, and that really resonates with us, then we want to pay attention to that, okay? Let's try this. Okay, our congregation's vision team will take the results of today's discussion. So that's what's going to happen. When I say our, it's really your. We'll take the results. You have a vision team. We'll take the results of your discussion today, in addition to what you've done in your small groups, prayerfully reflect upon and consider all that has been discussed, and at a later date we'll return with a report or proposal, for the congregation's ultimate deliberation and maybe reshaping, and we trust eventual adoption. Please appreciate that this is not a day for making a shopping list of all the things we personally might want our church to be, meaning it's not about our personal agenda. Rather, it's a day for exploring and discerning what God's future purposes are for us so that we might continue to be effective in extending the love of his reign into our community and world. And I hope you can distinguish between that. I'm of an age where I know I have things that are precious to me because they tap into sentimental memories maybe I have, previous generations. It's meaningful to me, but they may be things that I think they were timely in 1980s. They may not be timely and effective today. If it were up to me, I'd love to have those things still be a part of our worshiping experience, but it may not be effective in the mission we're called to today. So I just want to plant that as a seed. We will need to manage our time, although we might wish to spend more time on some topics, questions, and even allowing that we may not maybe get to explore all questions laid out here. Our leaders at times may need to limit our discussion to keep us on track. And I've already kind of touched on that. In the discussions we have today, somewhat controversial topics may arise that could easily divert us from the central purpose of the day. So if this should happen, it may be wise that we note them so that we don't get drawn into things that are not central for today, but they may be important topics for long-term consideration. and refer them to our congregation's leadership for follow-up at another time, if necessary, okay? So those are just some guidelines for us for today. And really, this follows some of for those of you, or I trust all of you, maybe have worked through the guide. It's kind of week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. So you'll see that part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 lines up with those titles to each of the weeks. So part 1, our first time this morning, is really looking at why has God called us here? And in the guide, I talk about that. For this place, He's planted you in a particular place for this time. This is the year 2023, and for the future into which He is leading us. And so we want to start, I think you would have looked at this passage earlier in your weekly reading, but I want to take us back to Ezekiel 37, 1-14. And I'm going to read through that in a moment, but I want you to note the questions I want you to be thinking about as we read through it, because we're going to just take a minute to talk about it. As we read through that, what strikes you about that passage? On a scale of 1 to 5, to what degree might we see our church represented by dry bones? And again, this is where we could get kind of, maybe we could wrestle with that. But sometimes do we feel like, we go through the motions, but is there life here? Do we see what we think we would long to see in our church? That type of thing. Maybe you do. If God wanted to put His breath or wind in us, like you'll see He figures into this story from Ezekiel 37, what would that look like? Would we even be open to it? What if He wanted to do something that didn't suit our agenda or preferences? By the way, I have no agenda. I want you to know, there's no agenda to rock your world needlessly. But underlying everything in this book is, I think, churches that will be obedient to who God calls them to be have a fighting chance for a future. But it requires our obedience. And that's what I want you to hear behind any of this. So let me read through Ezekiel 37, 1-14 with you. The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know the answer to that. Then He said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscles and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I spoke this message just as He told me. Suddenly as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Can't you just imagine? Imagine if this was depicted or represented with computer graphics or whatever, CGI in a movie or something. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies. But they still had no breath in them. Then He said to me, speak a prophetic message to the winds, Son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the Lord, sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds, breathe into these dead bodies so that they may live again. So I spoke the message as He commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet again, a great army. And then He said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, we have become old, dry bones. Our hope is gone. And that's, again, I want to tell you, as I work with churches throughout Atlantic Canada for 20 years now, this is the theme I feel I hear often in our churches. We have become old, dry bones. Our hope is gone. And that's why I use this. It is because I believe God wants to put a fresh breath of life into us as churches. I don't believe he's done with us. Therefore prophesy to them and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, O my people. I will open your graves of exile and cause you to rise again. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done what I said. And I've done what I said. Yes, the Lord has spoken. So I've commented a little bit. Just give me some things that pop out to you from that passage. Any thoughts? Thank you for these inputs. Again, I know we all bring kind of our fears, our trepidations, memories, but there's a few things even out of this. Like my assumptions really, and it's in the guidebook as I wrote it, I think it's explicitly stated. God only wants you as a church to be who he's calling you to be, not to be someone you're not. And I think what holds us back sometimes as churches is we think, well, we're supposed to be them. Well, no, that may be who God calls that church to be. He calls us for something different. But it's not the same thing that we are whatever we want it to be. It is what does God call us to be, and we'll be ideally suited to be those people for his kingdom purposes. But it is that kind of sense of breath, and maybe we touch on it. This is my problem. I talk too much. But, I sometimes think we can, sometimes as churches be those dry bones in this way. And structure is important. Form is important. I believe that. But we can have all those pieces in place and still be missing that breath, that Spirit of God in our midst. And it's just knowing that it's not enough that we just go through the form of church, but that we also are having the breath of God in us. So maybe I've already jumped ahead. So in terms of the question, why has God called us here for this place, this time in the future that he's calling us to, which I talk about that in the book too. It's a question that has always figured predominantly in my ministry. I don't know if you want to speak out on this, but on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think as a part of this church, you go, I think we know the answer to that? So maybe I'll say this. Do you think you're at the 4 or 5 out of 5 that, we well know what God is calling us to? Or do you think, no, we're at kind of 1 or 2. That's why we're going through this kind of exercise, is we think God has something more for us. So this, again, maybe the best way I can do this is just say, let's put hands up. I hate to manipulate the answer, but who would think they're at the 4 or 5? That we well know why God has us here, and we're, really hitting that. Who would think it's, if anything, it's more at the 1 or 2 rather than the 4 or 5? All right. So as long as you don't feel played by the way I laid out that scenario, and I hope you don't, then that's where I think most churches are at. To be honest with you. So let's talk a little bit about your congregation, because I believe God's will gets revealed by who you are as well as where he has placed you. So let's talk just for a couple of moments. Give me what's your size of your congregation? At this point, what do you think your average worshiping size is on a typical Sunday morning? Let's start there.
Like
35 to 40 sound right to most? Is there some more? Are there any others who seem to be regularly online joining? Just today, that's a question for some churches. Would you know? I'll look kind of the board and... Sure. And here's just see, this is something that later maybe a vision team or something can do a deeper dive into. It's always an interesting question. What is the ratio between an average attendance and the congregational size? Is it 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 1.5 to 1, if you know? So any ideas, like if average attendance is maybe 40 to 50, let's say, between in-person and online, how many would count Faith as being, that's our home church? I'll look to you for now, Gordon.
Yeah, we're not going to list it, but I would say probably 80 plus or minus.
Okay. So let's just work with that for now. That's probably congregational size. I used to, when I, as a pastor when I pastored in Moncton, we did a number of concentric circles. You could look at what the membership was, what our average attendance was, who did we consider to be kind of a part of our congregation, and then how many people were out there that they had no other church, but they had an immediate family member a part of our church. So maybe they had a child come, but there was a whole family, 4 or 5 other people. So it's funny, all of a sudden our congregational impact size was 3 or 4 times beyond what we had otherwise thought. So what about your congregation in terms of ages? Just, I'm just asking you to think about this. Others can refine it later. What's the most typical age range for Faith Baptist? Is there one? Okay. So age is
Probably 1 to 100 at one point, but now it's probably 1 to 90.
what's that?
Age-wise,
Oh,
probably is 1 to 90.
okay. So let's say 60 plus. What's a guess on that? For how many people of your congregation would be age 60 or beyond? And some of you might have different ballpark figures. That's okay. Would it be half, 2/3, a third? What's kind of resonates with you? Maybe 3/4? Anyone? Okay. How about 40 to 60? What's that? Okay. Smallest? Okay. And so really at least what for now, just to kind of be thinking about this. So I would say this, if I was working with you really as a consultant, don't ignore that. Sometimes we as churches think, we need to fill where we have the gap. Well, maybe God is saying you have a natural ability to have a ministry to seniors. Let's wait until we talk about who's in your community. But where will you have as a congregation a natural ability of strength? That's what sometimes we're so prone to looking at this as a negative, but what's it say to us about where we would have some natural strengths and natural aptitudes for the ministry that God might be calling us to, So what about occupations? So I would say if 60 and above, I'm taking that the lion's share are retired or semi-retired. Would that be fair? Of those working or those occupations out of the background, just describe a little bit, like white collar, blue collar. Is this primarily a blue collar church, white collar church? Upper, income, lower income. Any thoughts that way, occupationally? Okay. So representative of the community.
Yeah, it's a mix, suburban middle class, those probably.
Yeah. So what would you think about in terms of, yeah, okay, so let's just leave it there. It just gives you an idea. This is something, again, that leadership later can take a deeper dive into. What about in terms of your congregation? The neighborhoods that our congregation comes from. Let's first of all consider, does faith come from one community primarily, like Lower Sackville, Middle Sackville, that type of thing, or are you a commuting body as well? Do people come from a variety of neighborhoods? Any thoughts on that? What's that? Yeah. Yeah. So, a little bit on that is just to be thinking about the fact that when you think about where is your congregation or community impact, well, on one hand, you're physically as a building and where you gather for your gathered ministry, it's here in, I guess this is Lower Sackville, right? But then you all have neighborhoods around where you live. And if you pick this up in the book, I try to get at the point that's where your church is too. Your church is where you are. Not just where you gather in a building, but it's where you are. I mean, at your home, at your workplace, at your community hall, whatever. And what are the needs and the opportunities in that kind of a community? And of course, Lower Sackville itself is, I'm sure, not just a monolithic community. So you probably would have some working poor within it, quote unquote, that a sociologist or a demographer might. You might have, I would gather, some lower income single parent families. Would I be right in that? You might have families, kind of economically fairly well off, but with mom and dad, if they have two parents in the family, both working. So, when you look at your community, these are the things you would try to look at and just say, okay, who's here in our neighborhood? Are there lonely seniors? Are there people who have lived here 45 years and they might have had a spouse pass away or be divorced and they're on their own now with children living in Vancouver and, over in Europe or something, and they're cut off from their family? Like, try to pay attention and think, who's in our community? That's what this question's kind of about. And then, when I look at it, I think, why did I say 5 years? I probably should have thought back longer. But maybe I put 5 years just because to say, even 5 years brings rapid change nowadays. Like, what's one thing that has stood out to you about change in your community in these last 5 years? One thing comes to my mind, but I'll ask you. The pandemic. And what are some of the changes out of the pandemic where we're different now than we were in, let's say, 2018?
Well, people got used to staying at home and listening to the services online, and they became quite comfortable.
Okay, yeah, so the impact for churches is some people chose to stay home, some had to stay home, and they discovered they didn't miss church that much, right? And they're going, I'm not sure I really want to go back. I don't really miss it that much, quite frankly. What about in our communities? What's been one of the impacts out of the pandemic? Amy? You can see it, can't you? We moved into a section of Moncton a year and a half ago, so if you know it all, like it's near the new Costco, Elmwood Drive and McLaughlin. And of course, a lot of these people are people who don't yet have cars, so they take the bus, so that's who's out catching the bus. But I would think I was living in Toronto or Africa or something, very much a very African-looking population in our neighborhood that would not have been there 5 years ago even, probably. Not to the same. The other thing I was thinking of is the change of values in properties, like how much harder it seems to be for people to get their first house. Yeah. It's interesting. You make a really interesting point that maybe pre-pandemic there was a little bit of this, but it really kind of leapfrogged it ahead. So, maybe you had friends in your physical proximity, and they might or might not, but they might gravitate with you and come to church. Now, some of your church's ministry will be to friends and family, but who do not live within the proximity, and they could live anywhere, but they know somehow they maybe have history here or have connection and relationships with some of you, and so they're tapping in, and there is a sense of your church's impact that way. You're absolutely right. I just want you to know that from this is pay attention, is because you might have known the culture 10 or 20 years ago, don't presume it's the same today. As a church, you've got to say, how has it changed? What, and in a sense, because you notice when I say, why has God called us here for this place, this time? And I always add now, and the future into which he's leading us. And the reason I do that is because as people of faith, and we've heard a little bit of it here, and I don't step on your toes about it, I think we just have to acknowledge it and maybe try to resist it a bit. We have such a tendency to want to lean into our past rather than into the future God has for us. And so I don't know if it's in the book or not, but I use the comparison of riding a roller coaster. I don't know if that'll work for you, but I learned that one time because I had my wife who loves to ride roller coasters. And I'd get on and I'd be resisting them, kind of white-knuckling them. And then I thought, well, why do I do that? Why don't I get in and enter into the ride rather than resist the ride? And that's kind of what I mean when I say we have to lean into the future, to embrace what God is taking us to. Because I think that's part of the people of God when you read the biblical story. Anyway, we know there are verses such as Matthew 28:19 and 20, which says, go and make disciples. Or 2 Corinthians 5:19, we have this wonderful message of reconciliation. Or Luke 10:27, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Or 1 Peter 2:9, which says, as a result, you can show others the goodness of God. I mean, all of these kind of are verses that touch at why do we exist, what's our purpose, what's the mission God has for us. But how might our God-given mission be uniquely shaped given who we are with our composition, the community we live in, the culture we live in, and the time we live in? So just a couple of, any thoughts there? Like, given who we are as a people, that's our composition, who you as Faith Baptist Church are, the community you live in, the kind of cultural moment we find ourselves in, how might our God-given mission be uniquely shaped that way? So again, you notice I'm not taking the McDonald's franchise approach. I'm not saying that every church should look the same as every other church. You are to be a unique people, a unique mission, Faith Baptist Church living into its God-given mission. There will be certain aspects of your mission common to every other church, I believe, but it'll look different to a degree given who you are. So any thoughts at all percolating for you of what's unique to your setting or to who you are? Even out of a bit of what we've talked about this morning so far. So what might showing God's love in your context, given who you are, look like? Again, remember, when we think church, part of this is both our gathered ministry, but also our scattered ministry. Are you on board with what again, if you're not, I'll explain, but the scattered ministry is who you are as you pulse out into everyday life. So it could be in your workplace, volunteer with your family, drinking tea with your neighbor, whatever it is. But, anything stand out to you? You have new Canadians arriving all the time, let's say. People trying to get to medical appointments or, I just want you to kind of brainstorm. It's not saying it's what would end up, but anything stand out to you as to who you are, things you can do, needs that are in your community? That is, we live in a time where there's a great deal of skepticism towards people of faith, both in terms of what we hold to and also what kind of people we are. I think that's a change that's happened in my lifetime, which I realize it's, I'm now at the older end of the spectrum, but when I started out, and you can probably remember this as well, many of you, the presumption was people of faith were good people in our society, and we're grateful for them. And where today, many people, if they're considered people of faith, they are negative. That's a negative, that we're going to be, arrogant, and I can't say it, arrogant, bigoted, and everything mean. So really, how we live has to challenge that presumption. And there is, for sure, there's that. And I mean, I think, here's where I could easily get off onto a sidetrack. I think too many people perceive that Christianity is ultimately a live better kind of religion, try harder. And I don't think that's fundamentally what the good news is. I think fundamentally the good news is we mess up big time, and yet we are still loved. And somehow we've miscommunicated that message to be a moralistic kind of faith. But that being said, we also do have particular values we seek to live out of goodness. And so often when we fail to do that. Anyway, I just think, Amy, kind of what links what you said and what Amy said is that, people have perceptions of us today as people of faith. That's the reality. And one is that we are anti-intellectual. Well, I'll tell you, when I travel in churches, some of the best educated people I know are people of faith and most nuanced and thoughtful people. And likewise, I think even to help our neighbors know, that's why we put the second marker of a missionary's church is radical hospitality, radiate hospitality. Because if people can at least experience the kindness of people who identified to being God's people, at least we begin to challenge that. I see a hand here. It's interesting, and I can't pull a statistic out of it, but I would dare say people of faith in the U.S., or in Canada even, I mean, U.S. still has a little bit more kind of church and state thing, but, even in Canada, I would dare say, and maybe Borden's a better researcher than me, will go find this out, that more people are engaged in faith expression on a weekly basis than probably watch any professional sports or involved in any other kind of extracurricular activity. And yet we marginalize them where it is still a fairly common expression of daily life. I'm not saying that really well, but if you can follow it. But again, we do live in a time where there's a lot of perceptions that may be misfounded, but somewhat we have to own them too, I think, as people of faith broadly. That sometimes what people have said or done in the name of faith has been just abhorrent. And the other thing I didn't touch on, and this is truly a parking lot, some of us today, we have values that we think Scripture leads us to that do not necessarily line up with the wider culture. And then we're perceived as being unloving. I mean, so yes, there's LGBTQ, another one could be MAID, medical assisted death. There's a lot of ethical and moral issues that we are grappling with as a society that if we don't line up right with what the broader culture says, then there's all kinds of assumptions made about us. I'll just leave it there because I'm not trying to really open that Pandora's box. I'm just saying that back to here. So I just want you to be thinking about this, and as those who work, look at, and we'll go deeper into this even today, but who you are, that might, and given your composition, but the community, the culture, the time you live, and how that might inform you living out into your mission. So we're a couple of minutes behind, but you're going to break into small groups now. And I want you to be thinking about this. So this is around thinking about, for Faith Baptist Church, if you wanted to go this way, what would a vision statement look like? And in case you're wondering, for me, if I use vision statement, you could also call it a purpose statement or mission statement. It's really that, for me, it's that shortest statement that kind of gets at who you are as a church. It's interesting, I find it interesting, we've recently, as I said, moved back to Moncton after 20 years. We've gone back and rejoined the church I pastored 22 years ago, and they've done lots of updating of their publicity, their communications and logo. But I find it interesting that their key tagline or vision line is still the one we came up with. In their case, was connecting. They still work with that same connecting. And at that time, we just said, connecting people's spiritual hunger to the God who satisfies that hunger. That's kind of what we felt we did. We're centrally about. So, and the other thing is, you don't have to hit it out of the ballpark on this exercise right now. So don't try to get something that necessarily hits it out of the ballpark. But these are the kind of ideas that then spur other ideas. And then maybe together, one will eventually emerge and go, oh, that's exactly what's right for us as Faith Baptist Church. So you're going to go off and look at what would a vision statement maybe look like for you guys. And remember, when I describe this, it's honest. Don't have something that doesn't fit who you are. It's got to be, you got to say, yeah, we see ourselves in that. I say 10 words or less. If this is not the statement you have to work to memorize. This is the statement that you hear it once and you kind of can remember it. So maybe it's 1 or 2 words, but it's so therefore essentially unforgettable. I say it should be intriguing at some way. Now, here I always weave in my own bias. I don't necessarily read this out in the literature, but I think especially to those who are outside of faith, to try to get that where they go, oh, I hadn't thought of that, So this is not the theologically articulate, where you put all the Apostles' or Nicene Creed elements into it. It might be just something that's more like Jesus would have done, maybe with people he was passing by, and he just kind of puts a point of connection to them and plants a seed. And so in a sense, inviting and energizing, if that makes sense. So this is on your handout. A vision statement is a short-term statement describing the clear and inspirational long-term desired change resulting from the ministry of our church. Okay, so I've read that already. So compose a vision, that statement that would describe us for who we want to be and who we are committed to be. And then later you'll come back and take a few minutes just to share that. So if I can ask you guys, I think there's some people lined up to be small group leaders to work with this. Try to get into your groups. Again, just put out a lot of unfiltered ideas and then see if anything resonates with you. Absolutely. I'll see how, is this too loud or are we okay with this? Okay. Just as people come in, and most of you, I think, got this anyway, but when we were talking about that vision statement, and I've already have stated, like to me, I use those terms more interchangeably. There are books out there that'll talk about this is what a vision statement, this is what a purpose statement is, this is what a mission statement is. I kind of use it a little bit interchangeably, but I'm just trying to say there's one statement we look at that's kind of that shortest and most pithy that everything, so it's either like an umbrella, kind of like where it's kind of everything else we're about as a church, all of our other statements that become a little more theologically articulate, more maybe specifying the kind of activities we're involved with, they fit under that. Or you can flip that around and think of it as a foundational statement that everything else rests upon. So either of those kind of metaphors work if that helps at all. Just a couple other things I was going to say, when we're talking about your community, one of the things in just talking with Borden is, that's a change, is big issues that, at least in a previous time, I don't know how far back you'd have to go, is housing insecurity and food insecurity in our communities. Often in our middle class kind of suburbia, we never felt we had to face that a whole lot. Or it was really the aberration where it existed. It's not that way anymore today. And I think as people of Christ, thinking, it's not that, this is not about trying to find a hook to hook people in. It's what is God calling us to manifest his love and goodness into our communities. You got to think of it that way. When we're faithful in that will reach people. But it's not something we do it exploitively. It's more something we want to be about faithfully. And we can't do everything. The needs are far greater than what any one group or community can do. But what piece of that puzzle would God equip us well to do? Somewhat in our gathered ministry, somewhat in our scattered ministry. Then there's individual things you could be doing, that just naturally. And more than anything, too, and we're going to talk about this with Mission Edge, my thinking about the church has always been, most of us are already tapped out. And so often we're so programmed to thinking, okay, what else do we create that we insert in to make us even busier? And I don't know how successful I am in this, but in writing this, it's more about thinking about how do we equip you, both in terms that as you live your life out, you see how God wants to use you. Some of that is our gathered ministry. That is important. There may be new things to do and launch that we do centrally and together. So it's a both and, not an either or. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. In fact, in this session, we are going to talk a little bit more because, so bear with me, don't let me make you sick here. I just have to get into this presentation. I have found out what's wrong with my, at lunchtime, I've got to get, maybe my batteries are weak in this, so as long as I'm close it works, but it seems. What's that? Okay, they're double A, and maybe I'll get a couple from you after. So, this is, it's the way my brain works. So this tool is both an introduction to Mission Edge, and it's a process for a local church to say, well, what could we do? What might God be calling us to? Because a lot of churches, as I've said, that I work with, that I know well, are churches that have high aspirational desire. In most of our churches, if I go in and I go, do we want to love God well? People will say, we want to love God well. Do we want to love our community? Absolutely. Do we want to be faithful in the way the Lord would call us to be? Yes, we want to be that. Do you see what I mean? There's not a high need to try to convince people to that. But most people would say, but we don't quite know what that looks like for us. We feel like we're stalled. We feel like we're languishing, whatever term you want to use. And so this is an attempt that's kind of bite-sized for smaller churches, which is most of our CBAC churches, to say, okay, maybe we can find a sense of unity and a sense of where God is directing us. So Mission Edge Churches ties both into a kind of a CBAC initiative or emphasis we have, but it also is meant to be a tool to help small churches maybe find a direction. Maybe it's like, if you use the metaphor of feeling like maybe we've been stuck with our wheel spinning. It helps maybe give some traction. But I want it realistic to the church. And that's always there. So you'll see here on the slide, joining God in our neighborhoods. That's kind of an other emphasis we have. It's that understanding that God is at work. He's at work in us. I like to say it this way. He's at work in us, through us, and around us. So there's things he's already doing in and through you people here at Faith Baptist. In no way do I want to undervalue that. And I don't want you to undervalue it. God is doing good things through you. There's things that you go, that's really important. God seems to be blessing in this area. It really allows us to, both inwardly, as we build up the body within, but also then as we reach outward to want to kind of reveal God's goodness. These are important things we're doing. There's things God is doing. That's through us. In us, there may be things that he's stirring in us. There's things that we've been thinking about, longing towards. Those things might be of God. And then we look around us, and there's things God is doing. Maybe, we just look in our society, and we see what one group of people are doing. Maybe they're people of faith. Maybe they're not people of faith. But we go, that is something that would please God's heart. When I try to think about, how do we understand where God is at work, I look for signs of what I think that would please God. Maybe those people don't even know to do it in God's name, but God would be pleased by that and maybe that's a place we can be involved or help out in some way. So that's joining God in our neighborhoods is that aspect of we don't have to kickstart God into action. It is that we are invited to merge into what God is doing. It's more that kind of metaphor. I want to go back here, right here. So we came up with a definition of what we meant by Mission Edge churches. And we had a bit of a working group on this, and then I also took some individual roles. So probably the best parts of this comes out of the working group, and the weakest part of this comes out of mine. But we wanted a definition of a Mission Edge church. I wanted it to be, this is what I understand the church has always been called to be everywhere and at all times. So maybe it's a new phrase, but it's really a call back to us as church, God's people, to be who God's always called his people to be. So this would be in 4th century AD in Egypt, I think this would apply. Or in 13th century Italy, this would apply. So in that sense, a Mission Edge church is we are a community of Jesus followers. We're not just here, as church people. We are following Jesus. Remember, the first term designation for those who later came to be called Christians, the first term was people of the way. It was a way of life, really. It's predicated on who we follow. We follow Jesus. We are a community of Jesus followers who align themselves around his continuing mission of sacrificial love. Now, some may say, well, I thought we were Protestants and we knew Jesus' sacrifice was a once and for all finished act on the cross. Well, yes, right? But that's also the template, the pattern that we're called to follow is one of sacrificial love, of living out God's love into our world. Living love always involves sacrifice. When you love your spouse, there's sacrifice involved. As wonderful as I am for Wendy to love me, there's a lot of sacrifice involved for her to love me. I know that. Love always involves sacrifice. So who align around his continuing mission of sacrificial love, starting right within their neighborhoods. I grew up in a time when we talked about missions, it was always what was going on in deep, dark Africa. Mission starts in our neighborhood, but it doesn't end in our neighborhood. It's like concentric circles pulsing out into the whole globe. So, sometimes you'll hear the phrase, start local, go global, but we just said starting right within your neighborhood and from there radiating into neighborhoods all around the world, but starting right where you are. So, in a sense, this was just the definition we came up with. Communities of Jesus followers who align themselves around his continuing mission of sacrificial love, starting right in their neighborhoods, and from there radiating his love to neighborhoods all around the world. Now remember, the biggest number of churches that will ever look at this material will be churches of about 20 people. They can't do everything. I tell a story about one of those churches in the book that you probably read. I love the example of is Mount Denson coming up with their kind of God led them into that kind of choir for people in their community with dementia. There was probably 100 other needs in their community, but that was the one God led them to. And so that's kind of a bit of the vision I have behind this. Now, to what is a Mission Edge church, we said, well, we're not going to go with a report card approach. We're not going to say if you score 80% and above on all these areas. We're going to say, are these the direction you want to live? Wherever you're at on the journey, that you say, this is the direction we want to live. This is the kind of people we want to seek to be. And we said there's 5, kind of like what the Apostle Paul talks of the 9 fruit of the Spirit. We said, okay, there's 6 markers we think would be common to a Mission Edge church. There's lots of things that are embedded in these that we haven't drawn out. I mean, you might say, well, where's Bible study? Where's prayer? Well, I think living the way of Jesus as the first marker entails all of that. It entails communing with the Heavenly Father. It includes, knowing the Father's will. Hearing the Father. So anyway, a lot of them would be especially embedded there. But we really wanted also to get at this idea that the church is not just the church when you're together. So, think about who you are. And there's a story behind this. I mean, I could tell several stories, but one is when I was at First Baptist in Moncton, I had a lady got involved in a very worthwhile organization in our greater Moncton area. And she really became kind of indignant that she felt she was there, but the rest of the church should be there too. And she kept saying to me, well, the church should be here involved with this. And I said, well, you're there. And she said, no. And I think and she said, no, but the church should be there. I said, that's right, you're right, I agree. And the church is there, you're there. And I don't push too much, I don't think, to irritate people. I try not to. But I wanted her to understand, because she was there, the church was there. And then I said, I realize you could be saying about other things, that maybe we should have that organization in our budget, promote it, make it one of our priorities, whatever. But I just want you to know the church is there because you're there. So think of where I always like to say, ask yourself where you'll be Thursday morning at 10:30, and that's one place where Faith Baptist Church is. Because you're there. And then I'll have people go, well, I can't preach about God there. Most places you're not going to be able to. But you can show the kindness and goodness of God there. You can pray for people silently. You don't have to, you can just be kind of a person that cares. You can be someone who challenges their presumptions of what Christians are like, whatever that may mean. So this is that understanding. So I always like to say, think of your heart beating in your chest right now. It compresses together, it pulses back out, right? Expands. Compresses together, expands. That's kind of the rhythm of the church, week in and week out. You come together, you expand back out. In fact, what happens when blood rushes into the heart, and I'm no medical person, but that's where the blood gets reoxygenated. It's a little bit opposite, because I understand that the blood pumps out when it compresses. But if you think of it, we come together, the blood is oxygenated. We spiritually are renewed in Christ by being together, but then we pulse back out into our community. So the church is the people, wherever its people are, living lives patterned on Jesus, both when gathered together and when scattered, doing everyday life. So it's just trying to plant that seed. And this then applies, all the other markers apply both when we're gathered together and when we're scattered out. That we should be people who radiate hospitality, extending genuine welcome and kindness to all who cross our paths. That might be, the server who waits on us at the restaurant. That might be our next door neighbor. It may be the coworker who gets under our skin. I don't know what it is. We try to figure that out. I heard a story. I don't think this is a person of faith, but just thinking, I heard a wonderful story in Moncton this week of a gentleman who his car died, but who rallied and helped him buy a used car were the immigrant community in Moncton. And why? It's because he has spent his past years being available to drive new Canadians when they have appointments. That he, the Multicultural Association just knew he was someone they could call on when they have people who needed to go to a doctor's appointment or go see a government official or something. And he was just part of that kind of hospitality. I don't know if he was doing it in the name of the Heavenly Father or not. But that's the kind of people we should be, that we just kind of have our eyes open for opportunities, sometimes, formally, sometimes not. A third marker is fluency in the good news. Make no mistake, I fear we have lost our language of knowing how to speak the good news. That applies to me, not just, and when I say that, I realize I'm a professional Christian, if you know what I mean, vocationally. I've been lifelong. I've been to seminary. I have a doctorate degree. I still find it hard when I have the opportunity to share the good news of Christ, to say it in a way that I think will ring authentic to a person who doesn't have that same background. We have to reacquire a new language, I believe, that is the good news of Jesus Christ. So part of this is really saying we as a church want to be people who invest in helping our people know how to share good news. We want to be a church that when we preach, we explain what the good news is. Maybe it is that we use resources like Alpha or others to help people come and know. That's a priority. But it's not only telling the good news. The fourth marker is embodying the good news. And again, this isn't only to hook them so we can tell them the good news. It's like a two-winged bird. Which wing is more important? The right wing or the left wing? You can't say, right? There's an integrity. It's really, sometimes that's called integral mission, is this understanding that is both proclamation and demonstration together. So we wanted to get at this, and intentionally these are right in the center, third and fourth markers, right beside each other. Fluency in the good news, embodying the good news. The fifth is embracing partnerships as churches. A way to magnify your impact is there may be times you'll see things happening in your community that you go, we want to be on board with that. It may be a shelter in the community, a housing program, a hot breakfast in the school. And when I say you might want to be involved with it, you might want to be involved with it as kind of the gathered church, or you might want to just naturally be involved in it, and no doubt you already are in your scattered mode. But, as you're involved. So if you're in a bowling league, well, you know what? That might not just be bowling on Tuesday night. That might be a partnership that you get to be there in that place supporting something good for the community. But embracing partnership. And one of the things we find, and probably if I had time to listen to your stories, you could tell me examples of this, that sometimes the community will look at what you're doing and they'll go, we want to be on board with that. Could we help you? Can we make a donation? We'd love to help you with that. So partnerships can go both ways. And then the last marker is contextually responsive. Mission Edge churches, when I say MEC, that's Mission Edge churches, are attentive to the unique context, place, and time in which they find themselves and seek to live as bright lights of God's love in ways that can be recognized by the wider neighborhood. But we have to be astute to the time and place we're in. And sometimes we're not. We just feel like we're on the side of right, and we'll tell what right is, and we just lose our audience. And I like the imagery that we are to be like spiritual detectives and paying attention to what are the opportunities God gives to us. And look, most of the time, this is not conscious. Most of the time, this is more kind of subconscious. It's kind of, I think over time, it should just be innate to who we are. But we think about what are the unique opportunities God's given to us. So this is like painting a picture. I always say most people aren't going to learn 6 Mission Edge markers. But if it paints a picture that they go, that's the kind of life I'd like to be a part of and living. That's what that's about. So I'm probably, okay. So I'm going to move a bit beyond just, be asking yourselves, we're not going to talk about this here, but to what extent are we a community of Jesus followers who want to align with his continuing mission? Like, that's for us to weigh within ourselves. Is church just kind of a rhythm of life? Are we a church person, or do we say, no, I really seek to be a Jesus follower and intent on figuring out what that means? Because there's all kinds of images out there of what it means to follow Jesus. We can look and see all kinds of different examples. Don't always line up. And probably we all bring our own biases to that. But it's trying to say, okay, in Scripture, as we read that, what would it mean? What did Jesus focus on? What were his priorities as he worked through? I mean, I would just say this. Jesus was the most attentive and gracious to those on the margins and those on the inside of the religious bureaucracy. He seemed to have the most harsh words. And what's always, kind of fearful for me is that's me. That's where I live my life, on the religious inside. That's where Jesus had the harshest things to say. So, So how do I do with that? I don't deal with that by saying, well, then I'm out of here. It's about saying, okay, while I'm here, am I really trying to listen to what Jesus would call me to, even if it challenges my paradigms in ways that makes me uncomfortable. So anyway, are there times that we can have a different mission than what his is? And I think it is. I think and you guys don't have this problem. I do work with a lot of churches, and you know this, that would have old historic buildings, and it's awful easy for those churches to become museum keepers. And they wrestle with understanding, is their mission about keeping a culture alive or keeping some institution alive, or is it about living the good news of Jesus? So this is just meant for us to ask ourselves and wrestle with these questions before the Lord, okay? I'm not opening it up, but I'll plant those seeds and whatever the Spirit may do with that. So what I want to do is I want to move on to reading Luke 10:30 to 37, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, you do have that handout, I think, each of you, that I gave. So if you don't remember what the Mission Edge markers are, you could go to the page, which is, if you look at page 74 on your handout, you'll see the 6 markers. And as I read through this passage of the Good Samaritan, I'd like you to think about, where do you see some of those markers from Living the Jesus Way, both gathered and scattered? It won't say it. Know that. It's not going to say that in Luke's words. But where do you see hospitality? Where might you see embodying the good news, or fluency, or partnerships, or being contextually responsive? Just keep your eyes open for that as I read through this. So Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. That's kind of like what I'd be, I suppose. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." So which markers do you see evident in that passage?
I just see a couple of things here. I think the trolley's over here, and
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. So, yeah. So when we read through that, and as I describe those markers, which ones, which ones kind of stand out most readily to you? Yeah. In what way do you see radiating hospitality? Yeah, you're right. Talking about practical hospitality right there. Seeing the dignity and having compassion to the person who was there and the plight they were in. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Right here. Well,
A works as well. Still what Jesus did back in the 70s. The grace that sits on his Lord.
yeah. That's right. So, but living the way of Jesus. And he did it on his own. There's that scattered aspect, to whatever extent he was a person of faith. He didn't kind of call a church meeting and say, should we do this as a whole group of us? He was moved by himself to do it. So that's very good in the scattered mode. You'll see in this, I am not one who thinks the church is optional to the to the life in Christ. I believe we're called to be in community. I think when I talk about Kenny in that book, part of it is because it's not easy to be in church. I think I talk about it there. It's because we learn how to love one another in community. It's easy for me to come in on day right here. You might not find it so easy to love me because you got to listen to me, but I find it very easy to love you because I don't know you. Right? But when you know each other, you know how hard it is to love each other. But isn't that what we're to be doing? Growing in learning how to love each other when it's hard to love, if we want to be like Jesus? That's why I really believe in the importance of our gathered ministry, but I also believe in the importance of the scattered ministry. That's my point. Other markers you see back here. He embodies the good news. Where do you see him doing that? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. What else do you see in this passage, anyone? Partnerships. And who's he have a partnership with? Doesn't he? Isn't that beautiful? And that's right. Yeah. 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 And in some ways, he offered, if we're playing with this more, he even invited the innkeeper into the opportunity of ministry. And I'll just say, I think the last one, we certainly see the contextual responsiveness. I mean, here was something right in his path, and the other two missed it for whatever reason, maybe because of ceremonial law concerns, maybe because of being pressed for time, maybe they had, they just thought, I can't get involved, I might be attacked, this might be a setup. All of those things quite legitimately. But he saw the need and he responded. The only thing maybe we don't see in there, the only marker, is the fluency in the good news, right? But that's not the story Jesus is telling at this point. And you have to be careful. I would just say when we come to Scripture, be careful you don't build a whole theology on one narrow passage. Better theologians than I, like Borden here, would probably remind us that Martin Luther said we interpret Scripture with Scripture. That becomes the prism we look at, and we read any given passage of Scripture in light of the whole arc of Scripture. Does that sound good, Borden? You're a better theologian than I am. So, I love that passage for seeing these markers. Just, part of in my thinking is I want you to know these markers I don't think are just just kind of pulled out of thin air that have no scriptural grounding. I think they're there. So we're going to go into small groups for a bit of time. And here's what you're going to do. I'm going to pull these up here. So I want you to think about ways in which these markers could be important for you as a church in effectively ministering into your neighborhood and beyond. So you may not have to spend a whole long time on this part, but just be thinking like, where's the relevancy of these markers? Where might be some relevancy for us in our group? And then while acknowledging that these markers are truly interrelated and interdependent, like it's hard to be radiating hospitality without embodying the good news, right? It's that type of thing. Which ones would you think would be kind of your strongest? Which ones come easiest to you guys as a church family, maybe? And which ones might be harder for you? That's what that question's about as you look at it. And then dream of some new ways in which your congregation might encourage or exhibit these markers, be that while gathered or scattered. So again, you've drank the Kool-Aid enough now, right, that you know what I mean when I say gathered or scattered. And then, does the Mission Edge Church model represent the kind of church you would be seeking to be? A church that wants to obediently live out the good news in your place. Are you willing to commit to growing and being this kind of church? So there's lots of stuff there to talk about over these next 30 minutes. And you don't have to go linearly through these 5 questions or whatever they are. But let this kind of formulate and try to have a scribe in your group who will come back and tell a little bit about your discussion. And then we'll break for lunch after we hear from your group. Sound good?
Oh, I thought he was pretty good. Right now, he's looking good. So number 5, we talked about let me see now. Oh yes, where we found the markers strongest, weakest. So we found that we think as a whole, embodying the good news, we are strong, not strongest, but strong. Do you need examples or anything? No, okay, good. I can't remember, but anyway, do you remember? Forget what the examples were. So anyway, Betty, did you say that? We don't remember the example. Sorry. Radiating hospitality, middle of the ground. We are sometimes good at welcoming new people in, but we still don't go beyond the high welcome. It's good to have you here. Going the extra mile, like would you join me for coffee, that type of thing. So we're working on that one. Fluent in the good news, we find that we are probably weaker, except for Gordon, who is expert at that. No, I'm just teasing you. Anyway, embracing partnerships, we feel that we're strong. And as that we are, like for example, reaching out to Beacon House and the Warming Center. We do support CBM to some extent, but maybe not as much as we could. And we can still work on partnering with other churches in the area who would not be of the same denomination. Living the Jesus way, we are still working on that. Growing our Christian character, what it means to relate to one another in here. Like how do we connect and love one another here before we love and connect someone out there, out in our community. Contextual responsiveness, we're still learning what that even means, let alone being good at it. So we're struggling with that one. Number 6, dream of some new ways in which our congregation might encourage or exhibit some of these markers. We thought about, for example, a church-sponsored event such as a barbecue that we could invite the people from the Warming Center to attend. So having church-sponsored events to invite the community to. That would radiate hospitality, that would embody the good news, that would be living the Jesus way, and probably we didn't mention it, but in some ways, I think contextual responsiveness is in that. And number 7, we didn't get much time to discuss. the question, are we willing to commit to growing and being this kind of church? Our answer is, we want to be, ... But we're not sure where we're going with that one yet, so that's ours.
That's great, thank you. And as who presented middle last time, I'll go in the middle again. You know, I want this to be encouraging to you. This is not, my approach is not to browbeat people. I believe that it's in some ways, so a couple of things just go through my mind. I often will use a phrase I heard many years ago, the crawl, walk, run model. And in a sense, it's like the little children we see here. They don't start, from kind of just rolling over to running. And all of us, we are who we are. And so what is that next step we could take in the right direction? That's always kind of my thinking. And not that that's all there is. Well, that next step can lead to the next step and the next step. But it's not, enjoy the journey and the adventure right where you are at right now and what your next steps are, and even the discovering of it. And going, we don't know what it means. But I'm going to say this, but also do it in a way that encourages one another, champions one another, celebrates one another, even the small steps. Anyway, it's just some things. Back to you guys.
All right. So we did not make it through all of these questions, but that's okay. That's okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about number 4, so just identifying the markers each at a time. So we talked about living the Jesus way, about keeping an ear out and knowing what the needs are in the community so that when we are scattered out to the community, we can address those needs. Also, we talked about just living the Jesus way as setting an example or at showing people that we are Christ followers and not kind of being that hypocritical people that sometimes they think we are. Sorry, cat's in a note. When we talked about radiating hospitality, so we talk about it starts when people enter this door, when they come into our church services, reaching out to newcomers, but also at the same time we want that kind of duality of being hospitable with people coming into our church, but also bringing that hospitality out into our communities, not just doing one or just doing it while people come to us, like being really intentional about bringing it out into the community. For fluent, we talked about fluency in the good news and embodying the good news kind of as a combined thing. I don't know why this mic is cutting in and out. Am I holding it funny? I don't know what's happening. Anyways, we talked about mostly how to be able to respond to negativity. So we talked a little bit, actually, what you said, Amy, about how sometimes people see Christian people as like not intelligent and a very negative light. So how to respond to those negative thoughts in a positive way without kind of being on that defensive and being able to be fluent in the gospel in the face of that negativity. Then we talked about, so we kind of listed where our strengths were and where some of our weaknesses were. We thought that living the Jesus way, that gathering, that scattering was on the stronger end, but we actually saw our hospitality on the lower end because we're not consistent with it. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we're really good at, welcoming people as they come in, but then sometimes we're not. What other groups have said, it hasn't really extended past that, hello, how are you? So we thought that was something that we really wanted to work on. We put partnership kind of in the middle ground. I would say it's we're working on it being a little bit more stronger as we have all these connections and partnerships with different groups, like the Beacon House, the Warming Center, all the CBM stuff that we have gotten on. And then I don't really know where this fits in, but we had a little bit of a discussion about how age has always separated us within the church, and being really intentional about doing specific activities that encourage that mixing among groups. And I think that was it. Yeah.
Oh, and the last one was the last one.
Oh, right. I didn't write it down. But we did, I don't know what's happening. We did skip to the last question, but are we willing to commit to growing to be this kind of church, this missional edge church? And again, yes, very willing. And recognizing that it may include some hard work and some sacrifice and being willing to commit to that, but also understanding that sometimes when we have these excuses of why we can't do certain things, like, oh, I'm busy, oh, I have to do these things, that those things in our lives actually will be better if we commit to these things, to being a missional church. And that's it.
And just as the final group gets ready to come, just one of the things I appreciated, many things, but it just struck me is, you know, at one point you went to say hospitality and hospital and you corrected yourself. But I liked that because I think that there's a sense where we are to be spiritual hospitals for people. And we kind of talked a bit about that at the beginning, and I'm not beating up on anyone, but people have a lot of guardedness, and quite frankly, sometimes maybe it couldn't be helped. Like, sometimes the church being the church will hurt people, and people won't understand it correctly, and they'll be hurt. And you pray. I know when I've been involved in that, I pray someone else will come along and minister to that person in a way I may not be able to. Even if I don't feel like we blew it, but it just was an unfortunate outcome. There's sometimes like that. I won't take the time to explain it. But then there's a lot of people who have been wounded and disillusioned. And I think, yeah, it's kind of neat if we can be. I think of, I have a few stories where I think, oh man, that was kind of the best of who we were. But I've told this quite a bit. I don't think it's in the book. But in my first church, we did, it was quite an amazing fellowship of people. It was a time of growth. But we had this psychologist in our church. An agnostic psychologist came with his wife. And he once said to me, he said, Greg, I don't believe what you believe. I know that. But he said, but I will tell you, I love being here. I find something here I don't find anywhere else in my life. And I always thought, man, what a lovely thing. I wish I could tell you that man, a few years later went on to accept Christ. I don't know that ever happened. I probably left and kind of lost connection to him after that, within a year or so. But I know at that time there was something about he was experiencing us. And just that aspect of hospital, you got that thinking. Like when that part of hospitality, that part of who we are, so I was saying to someone earlier, one of the values I really like in a church is we say we want to be a safe place for people. That doesn't mean we don't have our convictions and our beliefs. I believe strongly in that. But it is that we live them in a way that we're a healing place for people. Some people can't even begin to hear them initially, but they can always be loved. So anyway, the third group, sorry. I'm trying to be really good and not just tell you needless things, but these are things that pop into my mind.
I can hold if you like.
Lead us, Derek. What would you prefer?
I can.
You're going to hold and I'm going to talk?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Derek opted to hold the papers up, which is the easier half of this job.
Keep the mic close to you.
Keep the mic close to me. I will. I don't prefer a mic, but that's okay. Well, I just like to talk to people, but I'll use the mic. We went through all 6 things and why they were important. I don't remember what the 6 things were, but we wrote the answer. Lives the Jesus way because people can't see Jesus directly. They see Jesus through Jesus followers.
Yes.
Hospitality shows that we're invested. It's not just talk, it's action. It's a good first impression. Good news fluency helps us communicate effectively and keeps the truth centered. We kind of linked that back to hospitality. Embodying the good news shows how faith is lived out, and it illustrates the good news in which we're fluent. Partnerships make us part of the larger church and world. Scattering helps us connect in wider ways. Contextually relevant is essential to staying present to the wider culture in which we work.
While acknowledging that these mission edge markers are truly interrelated and interdependent, which one would you identify to be our strongest two and our weakest two?
So it's funny how the different groups did it. We ranked ourselves quite good at hospitality, and we felt that we were good at partnering with other people and other groups. And maybe our weaker two were being contextually responsive and fluent in the good news, which kind of led us to a conversation. It's not so much that people don't understand it, it's that they don't know how to communicate it outward again, either by being more reserved in general or just not like knowing what to do with the opportunity when it arose.
Dream of some new ways in which our congregation might encourage.
We made a whole other page for that. There we go.
Encourage or exhibit each of these markers.
Yeah, so we talked about how we used to have more meals and more like not associated with a meeting or anything, just a general come to the church, have a meal. And Walter said he would do them. So that was a big deal. Susan's going to have a hard time with that. I skipped over that part. Walter said he would do them, so we can have meals anytime. Walter said he'd do them. That we've gotten out of the habit and that people are willing to back up the people who've been doing them. It is cutting out. Anyway, the meals we thought was nice. I like the idea of family camp because I've heard other people like the idea of family camp, and then I got excited about it. We talked about backing up things in our community, not like to make it into a church-driven thing, but just support, like actually just giving the community things, I think. I put down pickleball tournament, but I was kind of joking. And then we did talk about using our venue for bringing in musical talent or performances, sort of things that make the church useful to the community. Revisiting outreach to young people, like teenage people. A place and time to engage kids and teens, maybe with food. And then we talked a little bit about how fun it would be to have movies here. Just things that kind of tie the church to the larger community, I guess. Does my group have anything else they want to add to that?
I feel like we were dreaming about finding something that the community does not have currently. Because we were just saying how, when you think of Knox Church, you think of Freedom Kitchen. When you think of, the Rock Church, you think of, Awanas and Bible schools and stuff that they really do. So what is it that we could do that fills a gap that is not currently being filled? That's kind of what we were just sort of daydreaming about, trying to do that.
Thank you, Alice.
I will repeat that into the mic. Allison said we'd like to find a niche that our church could fill for the community. So we're familiar with some of the other churches in town that have kind of a specialty and then trying to pick a specialty for our church. Yep.
Yeah. Food for thought. Just two things I wanted to bring.
Just pull it a little closer to your mouth.
Just a few things I wanted to bring up. Can you throw that first page back up there? So after hearing everybody talk, so just over lunch, something to think about. So for contextuality, we're extremely lucky to have this man who can link today's world with his message. A lot of churches don't have that, right? So what are we going to do with that? What does everybody do with that? What do they take away, when they leave here on Sunday? So bonus, we need to use that to grow, right? Because we need to grow, right? And then with hospitality, I know we had it ranked higher on ours, but from the world I come from, it's like onboarding/retention. I know it's a different world, but at the end of the day, when people are trying different churches, they're only going to try it once, right? So, and then they're going to go try a different one, and a different one, and a different one. So when they come here on that first Sunday, what does that look like? But not just that first Sunday, not that high at the door. It's what does the second Sunday, the third Sunday look like? Because you can be really nice to somebody on the first Sunday, but if you don't give them the time of day on the second Sunday, they're going to go try a different church, right? So I think that in the grand scheme of things, if we're going to grow, we really need to focus on not just hospitality, but week 2, 3, and 4. And what does that look like?
These are phenomenal insights and observations. bless you. I like wherever there was that idea, I think Allison, right? About that one thing. There's a word that I've been introduced to, and some of you may know it. It's charism, charism. And it's, in a spiritual, it ties into our understanding a little bit about spiritual gifts, but it is kind of, what is that one thing that distinguishes who we are? Again, not in a marketing, that kind of thing, but what are we centrally about that people will go, when we think of Faith Baptist Church, this is what it is. That's positive, that's life-giving, that's inviting. And as you know, and we're not always that narrowly focused, and I just also would say as the body of Christ, you're one part of all others who are part of God's people. And I'm sure you do this, always have an attitude of blessing towards those others and celebrating and being grateful for what they bring, and then seek to be faithful to what God calls you to. Not so much competitive to them. Now, I'm not saying that because I heard it. It's just something to tweak. And I'm going to say something about your pastor, who I've really appreciated in the years I've known Borden. But I'm just going to tell you are blessed. This part I'll say, and I don't know, maybe you think Borden's perfect. There are no perfect pastors. I know that. And I'm not trying to say that. But I am saying that pastors, you guys are so blessed. Like we're right now, I'm going to say we're looking at a shortage of 100 pastors for our churches. And I say that based on the fact we have about 25 vacancies right now or 35 with about 5 available pastors, maybe that our churches have to meaningfully consider. And we're on the cusp of 75 retirements. When I look through our list, I would say that's about what we're looking at. So I'm trying to say to churches, value your pastors while you have them, and be grateful for them, and pray for them, and uphold them, and encourage them. So anyway, it just crosses my mind. I don't know if anyone needs to hear that, but thank you, Borden, for being pastor faithfully here. I know, your first name, Erica? And Erica, thank you for you being here. I know you and I haven't connected as much, but we will. And bless you for being here. Yeah. So, all right. So, the next theme, we've talked this morning a bit about thinking about who we are, that God's created us to be. And when I say we, I mean you as a congregation of Faith Baptist in Lower Sackville. I think when we understand our mission, we look at who we are. Who has God called, or why has God called us here? Who are the us? And then we looked at what is the here? Where has God put us? What are the needs and the opportunities within our community or in the communities we're in? And then it's partly is looking at, well, then what's God given us to work with? Because you are a well-resourced church. You have a beautiful facility. And in fact, I want to commend you. I said this, to Borden this morning coming in. The church looks lovely. And make no mistake, that's important when someone walks in. It just has a lovely, it's clean, it's good smelling, everything. I thought, what a nice looking space. A lot of churches don't have that. A lot of churches I work with. I would have some churches we work with who don't even have washrooms in their facilities. They have no accessibility. I mean, they just see the impediments. They don't see what they have, they see what they don't have. So trying to help communities of faith begin to say, okay, but let's pay attention to what we do have. What has God put in our hand? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit, and I want you to be thinking about. But I want you to try to be thinking, like in all of this, a little bit beyond the readily obvious answers. To thinking about those things you have that you might not normally think, oh yeah, that's a real opportunity or resource we have. So, we're going to read Exodus 4, 1-4. And I'll just pick it up here. This is, the context here is where God is calling on Moses to go to Pharaoh, and Moses, understandably, is protesting. So, but Moses protested again. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? Come on. I think that's, I don't know if it's the batteries or my. Then the Lord said, what's that in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff, and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. I like that little point because I would have jumped back too. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff. What do you, so here's the first question. Let's think about this rod or this staff that Moses had. What do you think that staff or rod might have represented for Moses? And just play with that image for a minute. We'll go farther than what the text itself tells us. We don't know much about this rod. But what might that rod have been? He was a shepherd, so what might have it been? Like, what do you picture when you think of this rod?
A piece of wood with a crook on one end so you can grab a lamb and lift it up.
So yeah, it might have been something like that, something very functional and useful for what his task was, his responsibility. Back here? Sorry, are you Betty? Okay, hi Betty, yeah. I asked you earlier this morning, and who was with you? The lady, and your first name was? Hazel, still is Hazel, not just was. Okay, Betty.
I see it as a symbol of his power, his leadership.
Interesting. And why do you think it might have been a symbol of his power or his leadership?
It would, because when he's walking around, he's holding the staff.
Yeah.
And the visual would be, I'm in charge.
Yeah. Okay, very good. I like it. Any other thoughts over here?
It would be his support.
His support. Something he leaned on. Something very functional. Anyone else before I move on?
This moment it feels like it's his new life as opposed to the one he left behind in Egypt.
Okay. So it's kind of expand on that a little bit. So it's kind of representative of what his new existence is?
Yeah, he went from Egyptian prince to outlaw to shepherd, and now and that's what he's been for a very long time.
Okay.
So now there's the prospect of going back to where he started.
All right. So what and again, I can't even remember if I talk about this in the book. Maybe I do. I have at place said, it may be a stick he picked up that day. I mean, I do that going out walking in the woods. You ever do that? You just see a broken stick and you pick it up as a walking stick. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's kind of, I don't know, I'm trying to say like an intergenerational ceremonial stick given to him by his father-in-law, something that had great tradition and kind of, prestige associated with it. I don't know. It was something for protection, no doubt, as some of you talked about with the hook, and something very functional, no doubt. But regardless, because we're just kind of playing with it. I got it going backwards here. What? I'll try to. Oh man, somehow I managed to get this. What was the unmistakable significance of the rod becoming a snake, of the staff becoming a snake? So when I say the unmistakable, I mean, sometimes I've heard sermons on this about what that meant, or tie it into other parts of Scripture where it talks about, even going right back to in the garden, the snake and Christ and all this. But what's kind of, at a very elementary level, what's the significance of this rod becoming a snake? What stands out to you? God's power is being shown, eh? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Anyone else?
God's testing Moses to see how strong his faith is.
He's testing Moses to see how strong his faith is. Will he be obedient?
Picking it up by the tail.
Oh,
Extremely dangerous.
you would think.
If he had picked it up by the head, it would have been much safer.
Interesting. I hadn't even really thought of that, Hazel, but I think you're on to something with that. Anyone else have thoughts to that?
It shows that God can use anything that's available to him for his purposes.
You're right, and Derek, right? And that's what, I say I'm very elementary about this stuff. To me, what stands out is that which is ordinary, and whether that ordinary meant ordinary in terms of being highly sentimental and heritage and special that way, or whether it was just the stick he picked up that day, it still is something very ordinary that became extraordinary once it was laid before the Lord. And God kind of like, sorry, your first name? Gordon, what Gordon said, I think, was, or maybe Hazel or Betty over here, the power aspect, where God revealed. And for me, for us as churches, as we look to find our way forward, that's the thing that strikes me. And that's what's behind this whole emphasis, is what's in our hand that if we lay down before the Lord, whether we think it's awful, whether it's something costly for us to lay down, which sometimes it is. For some churches, it might be laying down their building to go somewhere else. It may be changing their building to do something else. It may be changing the format. They'll say to better do the mission we're called to, we got to stop doing this and try to do that. Or they may not. It can be costly, or sometimes it's just the ordinary things that we don't even see their significance. But when we lay them before the Lord can do the extraordinary through them. That's all I'm trying to get to with this. Let's see which way. So I think I've already answered that question. What lesson should we learn from this passage? I guess, I think what we're saying, and I think you're on board with me, that we need to think creatively and freshly about what has God put us in our hands, that if we offer it to Him, He will do, kind of the unthinkable through. I want to be clear with you as kind of a word of warning. Not everything out of this process you try will have raging success. It be highly unlikely. You will try a lot of things that you'll go, well, we didn't really see, what we were hoping, but we still think we were obedient. But then there are some things you'll do, and it's kind of like the sowing of the seed in the soils. Like all of a sudden, it'll come back to you 100-fold or 1,000-fold. A pastor friend of mine in Moncton, who for 30-some years has pastored, really a growing church. And I remember years ago him saying, we tried lots of things that didn't work, but that was freeing because we said, hey, it didn't sink us. And that freed us to keep trying things that the Lord might be calling us to. And then we were able to find things that really did open the door for our continued ministry. So we're going back into small groups again. You guys are thriving in those, it seems to me. Bless you in that. And here's what I'd like you to do. Make a list of all that God has put in your hands. And again, like I do in the book with that story about Mount Denson, think about the things that seem very ordinary, but I don't know, here, like a parking lot, or, you can think of building, having some musical instruments, whatever it is, let your mind become a little bit free roaming on that. Things that often you wouldn't I really want you to think about the things you often wouldn't look at. Some of them may not even be material. It might be relationships into the community you have, or, that you're known in the community. As compared to some group that just shows up last night and no one knows who are those people on the corner of Church and Queen or whatever, Make a list of all other kinds. This is probably that, of resources that God has blessed you with as a local congregation. Again, a reputation, relationships. You're known at Kaiser Subs, Like whatever that is, and I say that quite frankly because you have relationships with some business people. Some business people know who you are. You know, there's those things. And then from there, we're going to look a little more about this needs in our community. What's some needs in our community? This picks up on some of the partnership stuff too. What organization or groups might be addressing some of those needs? So try to be a little free roaming when it comes to that. Like, so you're looking at resources you have, but then you're trying to think, okay, and then we live in a world, what are some of the needs around us that maybe we as God's people might or might not have a call towards? Are there, you know, we said earlier, there's housing insecurity, there's food insecurity, those are big ones. There may be, anyway, I don't want to give you too many ideas because I don't want to shape where you go with this. But then you think, okay, are some of those needs already being met? But are there other needs that aren't already being met? At least not fully. And might there be out of that some things that seem to spark within us, that God may be calling us? And what could we do creatively with the resources we have to be able to address some of them in some way that fits who we are? And then after that, you know, might there be 2 or 3 priorities that God might be calling us to move towards? If so, what might they be? And then I just want to, you know, are there things, changes you'd have to make? Would there be some things you might need to stop doing? Think of the children of Israel when they were leaving Egypt. They could not take everything with them. And when we are the people of God moving into the future God has for us, some things obedience entails we have to take with us. You can find lots of examples of this in the Old Testament. The Lord says, take those things with you. You have to discern what are the things we take with us, what are the things that we can't afford to take with us, and that we have to obediently leave behind. That's always, the people of God, a church that is growing will all, you know, when I say growing, it's not just about growing, but living out their God-called mission, they will always be wrestling with that. So I think those are the questions I want you to be wrestling with before we reassemble. I'm going to give you about 35 minutes to work through those. So those questions are on your handouts. Go back into your groups, and we'll see you right around 2 o'clock. So Amanda has mentioned to me that when I reference the story to Mount Denson, you may not have that story in what was given to you folks. Because when I sent this to your pastor, Borden, we did not have the book printed yet. And so I don't know exactly what you did in terms of putting a copy together.
It could have come up in the small groups, but it might not.
Okay. So the story, and I don't think I'm jumping ahead here, and I love this story. So Mount Denson, the truth is this church is no longer still functioning. But the story I tell comes out of kind of near the end of its life. But I think it was a real blessing for it at that stage. Heather Card was the pastor of the church. Heather had gone to seminary in her mid-60s, I'm guessing, and was ordained somewhere in her later 60s and was called to this little church that's located between, near Falmouth, between Falmouth and Hantsport, so not too far away from here. She had read a book called, I think it was called Asset Mapping, that was given to them at seminary. I don't know if you read it, Borden, or if Erica ever has, but essentially it's really dealing with the same question, what's in your hand? You know, what are the resources we have? And at this time, Heather's husband was still living, Lloyd. He was about a decade older than her, which is not really relevant, except that he had Alzheimer's. But he was still well enough to go with her and able to participate. And Heather was trying. She had this little church of about a dozen people, and she kept saying, okay, we're going to, try to figure out what's God given us to work with. So I wasn't there. I'm telling you as I best understand the story, that she's saying, okay, so what do we have? What do we have? What have we got? And like so often happens, no one is saying a word. she keeps trying to probe, what's God given us? Finally, her husband, and she said, I knew Lloyd a little bit, she said Lloyd was always supportive, wanting to do whatever he could to help me. So Lloyd said, well, I have Alzheimer's. And here's where my knowledge of the story gets particularly shaky, and I'm probably just shading in a bit, but this is what I understand. She said, well, yes, okay, but what else do we have? She didn't quite know initially what to do with it. No one says anything. Finally, Lloyd pipes up again. He goes, well, I have Alzheimer's. And so I think Heather then said, okay, but Lloyd, you don't just have Alzheimer's. Like, what do you like to do? What can you do, Lloyd? And he goes, well, I love to sing. And then they began to, that kind of opened up the gates a little bit, primed the pump, and people began to say, and they began to look at what they had, and they had a building, and they had a parking lot, and they had chairs in their building, and they had a piano player, they had electricity, they had heat, they had a teapot, they knew how to make sandwiches, they had a piano player, if I haven't said that already, they had hymnals. And they began to put all this together, and they said, well, what if we have a lot of people in our community who have dementia, and a lot of caregivers who have heavy responsibilities. So what if we said one afternoon a week we were to open up our church, and we essentially be like a hymn sing, but it came to be called like a choir for people with dementia to come and sing. And they'd have a cup of tea on and some sandwiches. And it was not only a ministry to these people who are often very isolated, but it was a ministry to people in their community who were caregivers. So they know for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon they could drop their loved one off and they could go get a cup of coffee or go get some groceries or whatever they were going to do before they came back. And then they began to say, well, then they began to get known. In fact, they were even on Live at 5 at one point about this, I think. And, maybe like the nursing home would invite this group to come and sing in a chapel service or maybe at an association service. So here's these people who feel like they don't have anything to contribute anymore, being asked to contribute back into their society. And so I think it's a beautiful story of a little church that looked at the most mundane things they had in their hand and said, well, what could God do through that? And they were a blessing. I mean, we talked earlier this morning, someone of you mentioned about the one thing they became known for. And there's an American pastor and church consultant named Kenan Callahan who talks about, and sometimes I'll use this term, about your one ministry of excellence that a church should be known for, or I used the term this morning, charism. It kind of lines up with that. And that's what they had. And again, it didn't turn their church around completely, but it injected new life and purpose into that church for a few years. And then, eventually they did end up closing. But I just love that story. That's one of my favorite stories to reference to get at what I'm trying to say to churches of any size. So that's the church. That's the question. That's the story, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, we're going to have you give highlights. And then, so let's, the group who went middle both times, how about having them go first this time?
Second motion.
Okay. Okay. If you're going to take a look at that,
Okay.
have that to look through.
So we talked about, what was the first question? What do we have? Things that we have. So we have our building. We have so much space in this building. We have lots of people who have musical skills, maintenance stuff, tech skills, organizational skills. We have lots of people who are just good in different areas. We also have people, the gift of people wanting to help, but just needing to be asked. And then 3 things that we noted. I don't even know what this question was. Yes.
Make a list of all the other kinds of resources God has blessed us with as a local congregation.
Thank you. Yes, so we were looking at all the other organizations in the community and how we've been able to partner with them and connect with them. So like elections, renting out our building for elections, that was a big thing. Also renting out to the school, that's a big way that, you know, God can use us to be partnered with others. And just renting, now we're kind of moving towards trying to increase that. So that's just another area. Also, we talked about maybe letting like the smaller churches know that they can rent out our space if they're looking to do anything. That would be a good opportunity for that. Then we were looking at what were the needs in the community. So we wrote down homelessness, food, and just the cost of living. And then we made a list of all the different organizations that are already touching a lot of these issues. So we've got Knox Church, who has the Freedom Kitchen. We've got the Warming Center and Beacon House, Root Cellar, which provides vegetables to things like the Beacon House and Freedom Kitchen, and a whole bunch of other things. The library that does a lot of like events for like kids and youth, and also Youth Unlimited, who's doing a lot of that stuff as well. And then when we were thinking about some of the areas that were maybe like lacking that we could connect with or we could put our focus on, one of the big things that came out of that was seniors. So we talked about kind of just some of the needs that the seniors within our own community are having, and just like things like loneliness and driving to doctor's appointments or even driving to church services. So we had a kind of a lengthy conversation on getting a more organized congregational care committee. We have a lot of people who are visiting seniors in our community, and we have, you know, for like myself and Borden really touching on the congregational care, but there's a little bit of a lack of communication between those two groups, and where there's lack of that communication, things fall through the cracks. So we really talked about getting a concrete congregational care committee that could really touch on this issue of seniors and what they're looking for. The other 2 things that we talked about were families having just a hard time making ends meet. And we'd recognize that there's lots of programs that are doing things like providing breakfasts for kids while they're at school. But what were some of the areas that we could kind of fill in some of the other gaps? And we talked about how, say for example, at Christmas time, we often will pick a family that we support. Like this last Christmas, we found a family through Schools Plus, and we provided them with Christmas gifts. But we wanted to maybe increase that and maybe do some fundraisers a couple more times throughout the year, and recognize that it's not just during these holidays that we want to be helping these families. And the third thing that we talked about was homelessness, where we did note that there are lots of organizations that are dealing with this issue, but they are always in need of more people, of more volunteers. So we talked about partnering with other organizations to tackle kind of that issue. And I think that was it.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I can't remember from before, but let's say the group that was back here, if they would come in.
want this?
The first one that always come back. Not saying you're my favorite, but you do come back first. No, promptly, yes.
I think whoever's talking should stand here, because this cord's not that long.
Is that right?
Yeah, I know. It's not indefinite. Like, it has an end to the cord.
Oh, I got you. All right. So, what has God put in our hands? We have great sermons. We have good technology. We have a great building with a gym and a yard. We have musically gifted people. We have people working with kids, nursery and children, willing volunteers, pulpit supply people, kitchen, food contributions, caring people who connect with shut-ins, sick and shut-ins, and we have Via Vita. We'll just leave her there. Okay, neighborhood needs. We talk about homelessness, food insecurity, childcare, lack of community, cheap, free family, extracurricular activities and entertainment, teen drop-ins, mental health issues. We thought that that was something that could be pursued. We have Beacon House and Freedom Kitchen and Warming Center and the library. All of those things are in place. And creating opportunities for us and outside groups to get together, such as community learning opportunities that could be held here in this church, seminars on things like financial planning, take a week and do that, another opportunity for mental health awareness, parenting, and motivational speakers. So those are some of the things that we came up with.
And then the final group. Again, I'm really pleased with the work you guys are doing in your conversations.
You want to be the holder?
Well, it's what we're kind of looking for, yeah, to see how the Lord is stirring.
All right, so things we have in our hand. Certainly the building, but we wanted to get specific. So we mentioned one thing is our technology, an assistive hearing system, which isn't a common feature, our broadcast abilities now, and some of those kinds of things. We have, of course, very accessible spaces. The building's extremely good that way, all on one level, and easy to manage that way for anyone with mobility challenges. It's kind of a long-term, big-picture-y thing, but we have land. We're on 4 acres of land when land in the middle of this area is, extremely desirable. And we came close to making use of that with Atlantic Baptist Housing many years ago, but there's no current working group working on that one, but it is an asset we sometimes forget that there's a big property here. We are very visible and central in our community. We're not far. We're not way off the beaten path to find us at this point. One thing we mentioned, per capita, we have a lot of pastorally trained people in our congregation. A lot of churches this size, you just have the one pastor that you've hired. But you've got me, we've got Erica, we've got Art, we've got Robin, we've got Derek. That's quite a few seminary trained people all in one place, and that's an asset.
Oh, yeah.
And Joao, sorry, yeah, there's another one. Yeah, okay, look at that. 6, that's not, no wait, that's, Joao makes 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no, Joao makes 6. Okay, but, that's like 10% of the active congregation. That's pretty good. Musicians who are so faithful and in offering their skills. We know that the group has decreased a little bit over the last few years, but we still have a really capable social team. They host great functions. People come and help them out, and that's an asset. We have kids. There are lots of churches that don't, and so that's and not only do we have them here, but we have them in our community right around us too. And so there's opportunity to make connections there. And a generous spirit, we thought that was a quality that we have, that when people know about a need or someone who's in trouble or someone who's sick or wherever it is, oftentimes there's a very quick and easy outpouring toward that. All right. You gonna dramatically chuck it or just, all right? There. Some of the needs we identified, I think, are going to be common. Housing, obviously a major concern right now. Food, we kind of group together loneliness or isolation or disconnection, and along with that is often mental health, as some people mentioned. We tagged on youth well-being into that one, which kind of ties into mental health, but some people will know that, especially in that Gen Z cohort, that the mental health crisis that's in the age group is incredible right now. And refugees and new Canadians, we talked a bit about that too, just the number of people from other places moving into our community. And oftentimes, that's not an easy thing to do necessarily. So those were some needs. And when we looked at ones that we didn't think were being met as well, we kind of fell into I think same as some others, that loneliness and isolation and disconnection side of it is, it's very difficult to create a government program that just sorts that one out, or a group that just solves that. And so it takes something a little different. It takes a culture, it takes a community to make a difference with that. So when we thought about kind of some things we had as a way to respond to some of that, well, we said, well, we have a very, very good space to invite people into. If there was a way to be able to gather certain kinds of people or people with particular needs. We thought about extending presence into homes, so congregational care came up in other places, and that was kind of that thought too, is how you extend that welcome and connection out to where people are. And then at the bottom, I think that was just me. I don't know if anyone asked me to write that down, but I wrote down culture of connection. Just the idea that, again, you can't program connectedness. There isn't like a three-step process of that. It's something you have to build up as a culture of just how we all get used to the idea of welcoming and entering into relationship with each other and extending our circles of relationship and care, and just making that normal and comfortable. And if you have that more internally, it becomes easier to offer that to others. So, all right.
Phenomenal. One thing we have not talked a whole lot about, and because in some ways this is like, to whatever extent, I'll say it this way, my dream for you is I know you've been on a long-term journey as a church. I have no illusions that, this is the start of something. And yet I also hope this might, my wife and I'll say it this way, this summer we'll celebrate 40 years of marriage, but it doesn't mean there's not juncture points where we kind of set a new direction into the next phase of our life together, And so what am I saying? I'm saying that my prayer for you is that you as Faith Baptist, you'll look back at this point and you'll say, that was a really significant investment we made. And that charted, clarified a direction and helped chart a direction that we followed for many years. Going back to my first, there's a tool I use in both my first and my second congregation that in the last couple of years, I've had leadership out of both of those churches. So one church goes back more than 30 years ago, one more than 20 years. And both of them, independently of each other, said, that exercise we did, we still are kind of living that out at this point. And that's kind of what my prayer is for you. And even some of our language, I was just thinking, I know what I was going to say. So I haven't wanted to... So I hope that it sets a journey that you'll be able to continue to look and find models or tools or insights or, I'll use the term paradigms that you'll find helpful for your continuing journey. One such tool we find is something called Fresh Expressions, is thinking about, we know that it's a relatively small percentage of the population probably who have much of an openness towards coming to our churches as they are, no matter how well we do things. Quite frankly. I have pastor friends, I don't know, I bet you Borden knows people somewhere like this who go, Borden, you're my pastor. You'll never see me in church on Sunday. I won't ever come, but you're kind of my pastoral friend. Or, and so Fresh Expressions is a movement that's really about thinking, if people won't come to us, how do we create church for them? Kind of like Paul did as he went out into I can't get the word I'm looking for. I got pioneer on my mind. That's not the word I want. But as he went out, frontiers, the word I want. As he went out into the frontiers and took the good news, and little churches began to pop up, maybe by the riverside or whatever. So Fresh Expressions is thinking about what would it look like if our people, where they have significant relationships, might be a running club, a dog park, a hair salon. I heard someone talking about a coffee shop, and we created almost like little micro churches as outreach kind of places to invite people in. Anyway, I've got a few of these books that, I'll leave with you if you want to look at some point. But some of the language we've borrowed from them and they borrowed from us. And I don't know, Mission Edge, whether in this case, in this book, you'll see the author, Michael Beck, who was with us not too long before he published this book. He talks about Paul, going out onto the missional edge. But we kind of picked up that phrase anyway, originally from some article that came out of Fresh Expressions. And also you'll see they'll use the term gathering and scattering, which is a term I've used kind of throughout my whole ministry life, but it's interesting to see some of the overlap there. I don't know why I got thinking about that, but especially this here part of attractional model is one of the things we have to work with, but it will reach a fairly small segment of our population often. And so is there a way we can create something out there? Well, with that's probably not at all helpful. Let's take a little, about 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the final session together. So, well, you've been troopers to make it this long, and if you're able to kind of be with me through this next hour, and it'll, at least, again, I think in terms of creating some raw material, so to speak, that your leadership team's going to be able to take and work with. That's what our hope is. So the fact that you folks haven't had it and not everything's there, the guide itself is more or less online. If you wanted to see any parts I've referred to that you might not have had access to, Amanda, can you just hold up that book? If it's not right there, don't worry about it. I can't, we have these available now. The suggested cost is $10, which will cover our print costs and mailing costs to get them out. If anyone would say, I'd like to have a copy of that. Now, that's kind of a first run, and Amanda said she'd look at it. I know there are some typos and things I want to make changes in. So that's why we only did kind of a limited run at the first of 1,000 copies. But we have some, if you'd like one, I just want you to know that. You can let me know at the office, and we'll get them sent out to you. I will say this. So we're talking, this one's called Mapping Out the Adventure, Mapping Out the Journey. And I don't know if you've read this part, what I'm going to say, but in my mind, for churches as I work with them, part of it is helping them envision a journey, but there's a few things I caution against. One is confusing planning the journey with taking the journey, if that makes sense. And I tell the story, and it's true, that there's many trips we thought we might take as a couple or family we've never gotten to take. We did some planning, and they never happened. And then there's other trips we have taken, and I tell the story of going out west in 2010 with my then turning 14 or 15-year-old daughter, she, me, and our dog, and we drove right to the West Coast and down to California. And then my wife joined us there for the way back. The thing with a journey like that, I say, is, we set a goal, we do it. There's some things we hoped to do we don't end up doing. There's some things we hadn't anticipated being able to do that we end up doing. And but it's because we're on the journey that we have that kind of flexibility. That forms kind of an image in my mind for a church family even. This is not to become your taskmaster, if you will. Some things you will anticipate doing and you might see them to fruition. Some things you might think you will do, and later you'll look back and say, we never really got to that, or that didn't get off the ground like we envisioned. But because we were on the journey, then we were able to also do these things that fit with the journey. Do you see what I mean? So I just want you to keep that in mind. I think that's important. That's the way I like to lead and be in an organization, and I think that's what's life-giving to people. So I just want to kind of say that. Let's pick up, and we're going to read Exodus 16, 1-4, which is not a long passage. Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There, too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. So any of us in leadership who know what it is to have people complain about us, we know we're in good company. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There, we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into the wilderness to starve us all to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." Now, think about all this. If you have a Bible or Bible on your phone app, you can look this up. But this is Exodus 16. Who remembers what just happened in Exodus 14? It's kind of a watershed experience. No pun intended on water. It's the dividing of the Red Sea. It's where the Lord God parted the Red Sea and the children of Israel, were delivered as the Egyptian army was crossing down on them. So whatever amount of time chronologically is from chapter 14 to 16, obviously I'm presuming that's still looming large in their mind. But here they are by chapter 16, and they're complaining about their conditions. If I go too far, I won't give you a chance to think about questions. See, I already kind of stole your thunder. So let me go to the second part of that question. How might that relate to our situation? When I say our, I mean you as Faith Baptists, us as Christians today, us in churches. How might our situation or be like theirs or their situation be like ours?
I feel like it's a case of romanticizing the past, where you only remember the good parts and tend to kind of forget the bad parts that went with it.
Yeah. Before I jump onto that, anyone want to say anything else in addition to that or in another direction? I have a saying that I think the whole Christian life, especially as the community of faith, I really resonate with the children of Israel leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. And I think there's some differences. I think we never fully arrive to where God has taken us. We're always journeying into that future God yet has for us. So there's that. And I think there's always that tendency, exactly as you say, that we pine for Egypt the whole way. And we don't have our eyes on where the Lord is taking us. We pine, we romanticize, I think to use your word, we idealize where we've been, and we forget. I mean, what was Egypt to these children of Israel? What was it? It was a place of slavery. It was a place of bondage. And I would contend, and I've said this in sermons along the way, our past, and I'm a pretty nostalgic person. And I miss a lot of things that are no longer in my life that used to be in my life, So my mom and dad and my grandparents and places we lived and churches I went to. But our past will always be places of bondage if we try to live there. We have to let go of them. I love how, trying to bring this balance, right? Everything's a balance. It's a nuance. Dr. Bob Wilson, who now is, I think, Professor Emeritus at Acadia Divinity College, I once heard Bob say, we're called to live out of our past, but not try to live in our past. And I like that kind of balance. I mean, if I was pastoring a church, the churches I pastored were historic churches. My first church I pastored traced its roots back to being the first Baptist grouping in Canada. So that landed at Slacks Cove in New Brunswick. I know there's always some discussion between those who are at New Horton or in Wolfville area and those in Sackville. But my second church was First Baptist Church Moncton that went back to 1828. I believed in honoring our heritage. I think we always want to have a sense of who we are and where we've come from. But it's that kind of, but we can't pine for the past in that sense. And often there has to be a letting go of it. Okay, we've already kind of done C. So we're going to break into small groups. Again, and here's where you're going to finish up with your work. So thinking about the vision statements you kind of drafted and toyed with this morning, keeping those statements in mind, discuss and dream up 2 or 3 possible, and maybe it's going to be 1. Don't get caught on the 2 or 3. Just I don't want you to feel like you can't talk about more than 1 if there's a couple of things percolating within you. Areas which you believe our church, your church, would be well suited to address and which you believe God is calling you to address. And here's, to do more than 1, you'll notice I say here, at least 2 should be directed towards those who are not currently a part of ours or any other church family. We have to push ourselves to think, this is not about what would we like for us. How do we reach out to those who are not currently being reached? I think that's that missional impulse that we have. So examples of key priority areas could be, I'm on the right page, right? Yeah. Could be, just caring for isolated seniors in our community, serving homeless youth in our area, providing practical life skills. At this level, you're not getting down into brass tacks of how would we do it. You just go, I think that's a group we should be aware of. And no one's kind of reaching them, and we have some natural abilities to reach out. So at this point, I'm just trying to think as I say, a key priority area. Ministering to single-parent families, filling gaps in food security, etc. But then after that, then you say, okay, if we've identified those couple of priority areas, what would some key action steps be that we could do? If we wanted to target, single moms or single-parent families, I should say, then what would be a couple of things we could do given who we are? If we have retired teachers, or we have facility, or we have a school meeting in our church, or whatever it may be, what would be, and your area might be in a completely different area. And, I think this is too much to say 3 action steps for each priority area, unless you can think of them. Put in a few. And then we're going to reassemble. So really, you're looking at, as you go into your group, in light of your vision statements, what are a couple of key priority areas you think this church could consider as kind of your ministry of strength, or the one thing, and then what would be some action steps that would allow you to flesh that out, to move it from just kind of that, wouldn't it be nice if we could reach there, to saying, here are some things we maybe could do. So go back to your groups. It's 2:56. You've got about 34 minutes or so. Is that right? Oh, you can have even more than that. Anyway, we'll see how much you need. I'll come give you a 5-minute warning.
Not as generous with the praise, but okay.
Okay, Gordon. I know. Just imagine how good it'll be when you get home and get to relax, put your feet up.
Is that what people get to do when they go home?
I don't know. In theory.
All right, well, our group had shrunk quite a bit by the very end. And I don't know about other groups, but the brain power remaining in the tank at this stage of the day is maybe a little lower, but we gave this a shot anyway. Because we were trying to focus in on the connection word and concept that keeps coming up. And so we kind of, I don't know how many things this is in total, because it's a lot of potential different things, but it's all kind of built under the umbrella of this idea of a ministry of connection. And we talked about that, what kind of connection? Well, we want to connect to God and to one another and to the world or the community around us. Those are the kind of the 3 levels. And so we talked about ways that we connect in a gathered sense, which includes things like ministry of ushering and greeting and following up with people, congregational care, and even things like the Young at Heart or social and fellowship events. Like those are already things we do, but there are ways that we could shape and change those perhaps to really emphasize encouraging more and broader connection. And we talked about the scattered side of that, so there's a lot of informal visiting and congregational care that happens. It's not organized through the church, it's just what people do to those they've known a long time and care about or hear and need something or whatever else it is. And so that's I don't know if that's exactly scattered, it's still kind of done as the church, but it's not organized through the church, it's just you're doing it. So that's the thing that happens. I wrote down the idea of what maybe some training or encouragement in neighborhood outreach. How do I connect to the people right around where I live or in the community group I'm part of or whatever it is, to think more intentionally about that. We talked about the potential of getting some more community rec things happening here at the church, and are there some ways that you do that? Or maybe it's not at the church, maybe it's totally separate from that, but it's another community you're connected to. And other interest groups and hobbies, so the places that we just end up because we're out in the world doing things that interest us, and how you could connect people to people and be a witness in that setting. And then there was some other things that fell out of that as far as just kind of the community outreach side of that whole thing, and so that included things like maybe it is community suppers on a regular basis, or trying to gather local churches. There's not, in Sackville area, Bedford area, there's just very little that happens that connects the different churches together. We all operate in isolation, and so maybe if you did bring them together, there's an opportunity to reach out a lot farther than you might be able to if it was just your own church doing something. Practical needs for seniors, so connecting people with needs to people willing to help fill those things out. We talked about things like kids camps or parents night out, or just things that help with childcare needs, where you could gather kids for a friend program so their parents can finally go shopping or clean the house or have date night or whatever it is, or maybe just have a little cafe for them here where they can just sit and put their feet up, and then maybe use opportunities to connect with them there. What else did I write down here? Oh, caregiver support. So that kind of takes us almost to the Mount Denson example a little bit as well, about just the people who are full-time caring for a loved one, and is there a way to help meet some needs, help bring them together, give them some respite. And the last one I threw in, she's not here to talk about it, but if a number of different times, Amy came up with an idea a while ago that has never been implemented, mostly because she went to school full-time instead, but it was an idea about creating like a meal prep ministry, like the idea that we would do something like get a Cisco account, or you could order in a whole bunch of food based on the number of people who are coming, and have a night where you have some folks who, tonight everyone's going to make 2 lasagnas and salad or 3 days worth of salads for their household, and you come out, the food's already there. People who don't know how to cook it, you can teach them. People who just want to, you can have some community. You can make some stuff to help your household. You pay into it, but probably less than you would have to pay if you went to the grocery store, because you can buy it in bulk through a different outlet. So it was like, okay, you'd bring people together, you'd help them manage their food costs, you'd you throw a couple extra lasagnas in the church freezer to give to people who are have a particular need or having a hard time. So that was something that came up in our own household a few different times that might fit into the grand scheme of all those thoughts. So that was all under, that was just the whole concept of community or connection ministry. And then we took an extra stab at actually coming up with a vision statement, although we still haven't knocked it out of the park yet, so I don't know. We talked about the idea about connecting to God and one another, or extending God's love, and I don't know if my 3 L's works that well, but anyway, or how we live out the loving way of Jesus together, trying to emphasize the together connectedness side of it. So we took one more crack at that at the end.
Our group was also dwindled a bit by the end of the day. There was just 3 or 4 of us in there. But a few of the key possibilities we highlighted were community events, something focused around mental health, and then a little project about welcoming new visitors. So to just kind of expand on the community events, we are thinking, we kind of were brainstorming about the possibility of having a group or a committee that sort of discussed and planned some events. What that sort of looked like to us was maybe consistently determining a time, like maybe the first Friday of every month, we have a community event. We liked the idea of having a variety of events that appeal to a variety of people. So it's not always something for young families, but they sort of alternate. So perhaps one month you're doing a sporting event that brings in, teenagers. The next month you're doing a card night that is for people that like to play cards, maybe more of a senior crowd. Just a variety of different events like that, but being consistent with when they're happening. So we were just talking about having a group, finding out what type of events make sense, what type of events do people here enjoy, because obviously we would want to be here so we can make the connections with people that come in our community. What sort of target audiences were we looking for? What kind of availability do we have in the building with what's already happening here? And sort of how do we go about promoting that so that the area and the community knows that's something that we are doing. For the mental health service, we were kind of wondering or trying to think about what mental health services are available. Are there Christian mental health individuals that can come and set up here, potentially in the church at different times? What would that look like? That type of conversation. Probably, again, needing a group of people to come together to sort of discuss what that could look like. And for the little welcoming new visitors, it was just, again, brought up about how when we do have people come in, it's sometimes the first and only impression they get of us. So what can we do to help them understand a little bit more about who we are and what we do? Do we have a pamphlet that highlights these things that we do as a group or a church? So that talks about Sunday school or small groups or things that are available. People like to look for events. What can they do? What's something they can engage in? So just finding ways to quickly connect that with new visitors, because you only sometimes get a chance to see them once and then they've moved on to a different church. So it's about how to sort of make that quick connection. So these were some of the areas we kind of thought we have a lot of room to grow in and a lot of skills and people that can contribute to these types of events. So that's where we were. Second page. Okay, that's it.
For sure, very good. And then our last week.
Okay, so our group, I think we mainly focused on a lot of like the outreach kind of stuff. So their first one was caring for isolated seniors in our community. And I think where the discussion has gone, it's really landed under that umbrella of having a good congregation/community care committee, although we did have a lot of discussion around how nobody likes the word committee, and when they hear it, they want nothing to do with it. So maybe we just don't use that word. But a group of people who do these things. So some of our actions plans for that was A, create a committee or group, whatever we want to call it. Second step would be identifying the seniors and what their needs are. And the third step would be who can do what. So identifying the volunteers or people within our group that have different skills and abilities. So maybe there's people who really love talking on the phone, and that can be their area that they work in, that they call these people, that they just have conversations. Or maybe there's people who are really good at cooking or baking, and they can drop off meals. Or maybe there are people who have the time and are good at running, say, like a yoga class here at the church, or doing like an art class at the church where we can invite those seniors into and have that connection point, which goes which battles kind of like that isolation aspect. The second one that we talked about was filling gaps in food insecurity. So we talked about finding organizations that are already doing this well. I think we really talked about a lot about having our church partner with other organizations that are doing things really well. So there's lots of places that are working with food areas, like we listed the Lion's Den, which runs under the library. So it would be, first step would be finding those organizations. Second step would be, I can't read that. Oh, advertising in our church community. What partners what we're doing, what we're looking at partnering with. And then third step would be like finding people who can assist, finding those volunteers that want to be able to partner with these other organizations. And the last one we talked about was focusing on families having a hard time financially or just a hard time in general. So kind of the same deal as filling in the food insecurity gaps, finding those organizations. So I think we were really focused on partnering with other people. And then finding volunteers to help with things such as tot times. Like Rose has always done tot time, and that is a great thing that we've done, but she would need help in those things. So finding people that can maybe help in those things. And then other things such as organizing church donation drives, like we've done that in the past, over like holidays, getting our kids involved in it, just getting everybody involved in those outreach areas. And I think that was it. That's it.
Well, if I'm really short in what I say, we'd be done at our finish time. And I wouldn't have to have union complaints like Gordon mentioned. I think you guys are on a good track. I'm really quite impressed with the things that you were thinking about. You know, there will be things I may have said today, you know, as showing my own biases or inclinations, and you may go in another direction. I want you to know this is your journey, so don't get hung up. That's just one of the things in my mind. I would say try to keep a both and kind of thinking about how do we receive people if they enter in. I've always said, although I'm not a big subscriber to an attractional model of ministry like maybe back in the 90s, what we do want to do is be well set up and well prepared to receive people as they come so that they have a positive experience, they feel a genuine welcome, that we don't needlessly burn bridges with them. Absolutely. You know, one thing I don't know that I've heard a lot about, and maybe there's a reason why, and maybe there's not, but in terms of partnerships, and maybe I've just missed it, but you do have one, I think I'm right in saying, you have one segment of the community who's in here every day, which is through your school. And maybe some of those have, regardless whether they have a church background, but my guess is, unless it's an explicitly Christian school, that there may be people who have, you know, that's a group just to know. These are people in your sphere every day, one way or another, even at least maybe dropping off kids or picking them up, to think, how do we bless them? How do we show kindness and love and care for them? Because that's someone God's given to us, right? We don't even have to go out. And you have to know what your limits are, and I don't know what they are. I know when I lived in Vancouver as a student, we had a daycare in the church I was a part of, and it was a very separate organization. When I pastored in Moncton at First Baptist, we had a daycare, and it was still its own organization, but we were able to have closer relationships kind of with the families and with the parents. But, you know, just thinking, that's just one group I kind of thought of. But I just think you folks have really done tremendously well today. Just, you know, to sit on a Saturday through this and contribute and be thinking. And, you know, I would ask you to continue to pray for your leadership, for you as a congregation. One of the best things you have to offer is a sense of community and belonging. Every church has that. And as much as we talked earlier, some of you today, about this cocooning, this, you know, people kind of withdrawing into their own little space. We don't like to be inconvenienced and committed to a group. There is that societal tendency, but it's leaving people quite isolated and lonely, frankly. And at a certain point, that kind of breaks and they recognize their need. And are we a kind of people that they'd be easy to come into? And you know, this, again, has nothing to do with you folks, but one of the things it's to always remember, like, no one wants to come in for our drama. What I mean by that is, you know, if we can't get along with one another and care for one another, and people go, oh, I love being in this group. And so I'm going to close with a verse I love that comes out of the Message, and it comes out of Romans 15. And I was asked to do a devotional earlier this week, and I read out of this because it kind of touches on this very theme. I'll just read these verses and leave it, and then pray for you, and we'll be done. Again, out of the Message, it'll be a little bit different than if you read it out of the New International Version or out of the New Living or one of those. But the words of Paul, those of us who are strong and able in the faith need to step in and lend a hand to those who falter and not just do what is most convenient for us. Strength is for service, not status. Each one of us needs to look after the good of the people around us, asking ourselves, how can I help? Now again, Paul's kind of seems to be writing within the community of faith. That also applies as we think about beyond ourselves. Each of us needs to look to after the good of the people around us. That's exactly, after all, what Jesus did. He didn't make it easy for himself by avoiding people's troubles, but waded right in and helped out. I took on the troubles of the troubled, is the way Scripture puts it. Even if it was written in Scripture long ago, this is Paul writing, you can be sure it's written for us. God wants the combination of his steady, constant calling and his warm personal counsel in Scripture to come to characterize us. You can read back through this and kind of, because there's a lot to think about. Keeping us alert for whatever he will do next, which is kind of like joining God in the neighborhood. That's what we're desiring, to keep alert to what he is doing. And then he says, may our dependably steady and warmly personal God develop maturity in you, and here's the sign of maturity, by the way, so that you get along with each other as well as Jesus gets along with us all. Then we'll be a choir, not our voices only, but our very lives, singing in harmony in a stunning anthem to the God and Father of our Master Jesus. So, lots of imagery in that just causes my brain and spirit to dance. So, and I'm a Baptist, so there's not much dancing going on otherwise. Because no rhythm in this body, let me tell you. So let me pray for you. God, thank you for a good day. Bless these people. May they, if they go home fatigued, may they be able to get a chance to rest, to enjoy just the goodness, Father, of your provisions in this day. Watch over each one. Bless them. Watch over this church family, God. Guard them against every scheme that Satan would seek to bring against it. And Father, may they continue to grow into the community and the people that you call them to be to your glory. And we pray these things all in Christ's name. Amen.